everyone, welcome back to another video. I'm Chrissy, and if you don't already know, I work really closely with Craft Resin to help bring you hopefully really useful and helpful videos. In this video we're going to be talking all things air bubbles and how to avoid them, how to deal with them, and what to do if they're there once it's set. So these are my top 10 tips, that's really hard to say, on air bubbles in resin. The first thing I want to talk about is how to avoid air bubbles, because if you can do anything to avoid it, then that's great. So tip number one is mix slowly. So once you've got your resin and your hardener combined, make sure that when you're mixing it nice and slowly. Quite often I've seen people mix really quickly and then wonder why there's air bubbles. This is just going to create lots and lots of air bubbles. So take your time. I find mixing for longer is better than mixing quickly, and yes, it's combined, but then you've got the problem of air bubbles. So maybe stick on some music, whack on a TV show that you want to binge watch in the background, or a podcast or something, and just take your time with this step, because it's the most important step when working with resin. Tip number two is you can heat your resin beforehand. Obviously it depends what temperature that you're living in, and what I mean by this is you get your bottles of resin and you stick them in a nice little warm bath. I would say warm them for about 5 to 10 minutes. You don't want to warm it much more than that, because when you come to mix them, you don't want the chemical reaction to happen too quickly. So two things when you're heating up your resin beforehand. One, make sure that you are not using boiling water. You don't want to do that. You just want it to be like lukewarm water. And number two, make sure that you're not leaving it too long to sit in the water as well. Tip number three, once you've mixed your resin together and your hardener, let your resin sit for a few minutes. Be really careful that you don't let it sit for too long, because you don't want it to flash cure. But I have definitely found that once I have mixed my resin, I tend to mix like a pint at a time because I have loads of projects all at the same time, but I let it sit for maybe 3 to 5 minutes. Keep checking it just gently, because you don't want it to flash cure, so make sure it's not heating up like too fast. But yeah, I find after letting it sit for a few minutes, any air bubbles that there are, they all rise to the top, and then I spritz some alcohol spray onto it and then give it another little mix and done. I actually find, for me personally, that is the most effective thing, to let your resin sit for a few minutes before pouring. Okay, so the next little segment I'm going to talk about how to deal with air bubbles. If you've mixed it up, you've done everything you possibly can, but they're still there, how do you deal with them? How do you make them go away? So tip number four is, once you've poured your resin and you're getting those bubbles pop up, I'm sure we've all had it, you can use a heat gun or a blowtorch. My favourite thing to use is a heat gun over a blowtorch. You can use a blowtorch, but just be really careful, because it can burn your resin. So make sure you continually move your blowtorch around and don't keep it in one spot too long. Same with the heat gun, don't keep it in one spot too long and go over your work. But I just find a heat gun is really effective in getting rid of air bubbles. Tip number five is that you can use alcohol spray. I mentioned it briefly before about when air bubbles rise. It's actually amazing to watch. If you get air bubbles and you spritz some alcohol spray, they like give it a minute or so and they start dispersing and like disappearing. It's amazing. So yeah, if you haven't tried that, definitely give it a go. If you just type in on Amazon alcohol spray, it will come up, and I use it every single day pretty much, so I definitely do recommend to do that too. Tip number five, no, that's not five. Tip number six is, if you see them and they're like on the edge, you can get like a cocktail stick, or I use you know, like the jumbo lollipop sticks that's like on an ice cream. That's what I use. Get like your lollipop stick or your cocktail stick and you kind of like push the air bubble out. That works as well. And last but not least, I'm going to go through what to do if your piece is set and then you realise that there's an air bubble. So depending on where your bubble is when your piece is set is going to depend on how you deal with it. So tip number 7 is you can tape and then repour. So say that your bubble is in the middle of a piece, for instance, or on an edge, you can tape around it and stand it up in a way, and then mix a little bit of resin, get a cocktail stick, dip your cocktail stick into the resin, and then like fill the hole, and that works great as well. It can be really effective, and you actually don't see the line afterwards, so it is possible to do it that way. Which leads me on to tip number 8, which I like to call drill and fill. So if you've got an air bubble that's just under the surface, you can get, I use a Dremel, but you can just drill ever so slightly into your piece and then fill it up with resin. Again, a cocktail stick is great for this because it's really precise and you don't get drips everywhere. Or you can use like a little pipette, that can be helpful too, and just fill it up, and there you go, done. Tip number 9, I do this with most pieces anyway, just to clean them up, and that is to get a little file and file around your edges if there's like little bubbles or chips as people like to call them. This is actually a file that I like to use. I also have a massive version of this for bigger pieces, so it's like a really big piece. So again, if you search on Amazon, file, it will come up. But yeah, I do find that really effective with dealing with air bubbles. And lastly, I just wanted to say, don't worry if you get air bubbles. It's completely normal. I know as a resin artist it can be so frustrating, but with every piece you're learning, you're growing, and it's all part of the fun. Sometimes art is best when it's imperfectly perfect, so just remember that and try not to worry so much. And that's it. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any more tips, definitely drop them in the comments below, and other than that, I will see you in the next video.